Sarah, March 1944. At a top-secret German aircraft testing center called Rechlin, engineers are about to examine a captured American fighter. Another P-47 Thunderbolt, maybe? Or a P-38 Lightning? No, this was different. This was a P-51 Mustang, shot down just 2 days earlier during the very first American fighter escort mission all the way to Berlin. Berlin? But German intelligence insisted that was impossible. They believed single-engine fighters simply didn't have the range to go that deep into Germany and back. Exactly. Their analysis of captured P-47s and P-38s showed limited range. Yet here was evidence. American Mustangs had fought over Berlin and returned to England. How could that be? The distance is over 1,000 miles round trip. That's the question haunting the German High Command. The pilot hadn't survived the crash, but the Mustang was mostly intact. Inside the cockpit, they even found his navigation charts, clearly showing the route, England to Berlin and back. The Germans needed answers, fast.
So, the experts at Rechlin start tearing the Mustang apart. What did they focus on first?
Fuel. It had to be fuel. They meticulously measured the internal fuel tanks, 2 in the wings holding 92 gallons each,
Okay, that's 184 gallons.
plus a newer addition they noted, an 85-gallon tank tucked into the fuselage right behind the pilot.
So, 269 gallons total internal capacity. That sounds like a lot.
It was. But then they looked at the engine. It was the Packard-built Merlin, the same legendary engine Rolls-Royce used in the Spitfire, which gave the Mustang its incredible high-altitude performance.
But powerful engines drink a lot of fuel.
At cruise settings, around 70 gallons per hour, so 269 gallons divided by 70, that gives you about 3.8 hours of flight time.
At the Mustang's cruise speed of maybe 300 miles per hour, that's just under 1,200 miles range.
Exactly. Just enough to barely reach Berlin and get back, with absolutely zero fuel left for fighting, maneuvering, or unexpected headwinds. Yet German pilots reported intense dogfights over Berlin lasting 20 minutes. It didn't add up.
So, the internal fuel wasn't enough to explain the combat reserves. What did they look at next?
The wings. They noticed the standard hardpoints underneath, attachment points designed for external stores. Crucially, these hardpoints had fuel line connections.
Drop tanks. External fuel tanks that could be jettisoned.
Exactly. Drop tanks weren't a new idea. German fighters used them all the time. The Bf-109 and FW-190 both carried external tanks for longer missions.
So, the question wasn't if the Americans were using drop tanks, but what kind of drop tanks?
And how big were they? And, critically, how were the Americans producing enough of them to equip hundreds of fighters for daily missions deep into Germany?
They needed to find one.
Urgently. Intelligence officers figured out the likely areas where pilots would have dropped their tanks, usually right before engaging German fighters. Search teams fanned out across the countryside near Berlin.
Within a few days, they found several objects. Most were just fragments, but 2 tanks were recovered almost perfectly intact, having landed in soft fields.
And these were the answer?
They were the key that unlocked a terrifying realization for the Germans. The tanks were cylindrical, about 9 feet long.
What was their capacity?
Calculations showed each held about 108 US gallons.
So 2 of those tanks added another 216 gallons.
Bringing the Mustang's total fuel load to a massive 485 gallons.
Let's do the math again. 485 divided by 70 gallons per hour. That's almost 7 hours of flight time.
giving the Mustang a range well over 2,000 miles, more than enough for Berlin, with plenty of fuel left for intense combat and a safe return. The range mystery was solved.
But you said this discovery was terrifying. It wasn't just the amount of fuel, was it?
No, Sarah. It was what the tanks were made of. That's what truly stunned the engineers at Rechlin.
What do you mean? Weren't they just aluminum, like the German drop tanks?
That's what they expected, but when they touched the surface, even under the silver paint, the texture was wrong. It wasn't metal.
Not metal. What else could it be?
They carefully scraped away some paint near the tail cone. What they found underneath was layer upon layer of heavy paper.
Paper? You're telling me these fuel tanks were made of paper?
Laminated craft paper, the same tough stuff used for industrial shipping containers. At least 12 layers, compressed and bonded together with a powerful resin adhesive, likely a resorcinol formaldehyde.
How could paper possibly hold aviation fuel?
The inside was coated with a special fuel-resistant lacquer. The construction was surprisingly sophisticated, with wooden baffles inside to stop fuel sloshing around. The nose and tail cones were molded from overlapping paper pieces, like papier-mâché, while the center section was seamlessly wrapped.
It sounds bizarre, but also clever.
It was brilliantly pragmatic, and the implications hit the German engineers like a physical blow.
What were the implications? Why was a paper tank so significant?
Because paper and wood resin are non-strategic materials. Germany was desperately short of aluminium and steel. Every ounce was needed for aircraft structures, engines, armor.
But the Americans had so much aluminum they didn't even need to use it for drop tanks?
Precisely. They chose paper. And think about the manufacturing. You don't need specialized metalworking tools or highly skilled welders. You could make these things in any paper mill or packaging factory.
Factories that America had in abundance.
Hundreds of them. The tanks had no serial numbers, no manufacturer markings. They were clearly mass-produced commodity items, completely expendable.
Disposable fuel tanks.
German intelligence looked up US paper production figures. They were astronomical. Converting even a tiny fraction of that capacity could yield hundreds of thousands of drop tanks per month.
Way more than they could possibly need.
It wasn't about scarcity for the Americans. It was about optimization. Paper tanks were cheaper, faster to produce using less skilled labor, and freed up critical materials and factory space for other things. It was industrial efficiency on a scale the Germans couldn't fathom.
So this wasn't even an American invention originally?
No, the Germans eventually traced it back to the British, who developed paper tanks in 1943 specifically to conserve aluminum.
Driven by British scarcity.
But exploited on a massive scale by American industrial might. And this discovery prompted the Germans to look closer at all captured American equipment.
What did they find? Was everything paper?
No, but they saw a consistent pattern. American equipment wasn't always technically superior in individual components. German optics might be better, German engines more precisely crafted. But American equipment was consistently better manufactured for mass production. It was standardized, reliable, and available in overwhelming quantities.
The German approach was different.
Completely. German tanks and aircraft were often engineering masterpieces, hand-fitted by skilled craftsmen. But that process was slow, expensive, and couldn't be scaled up easily. The Germans built superior individual items. The Americans built adequate items in crushing numbers.
The P-51 Mustang itself is a perfect example of that American approach, isn't it?
Absolutely. North American Aviation designed and built the first prototype in an astonishing 117 days back in 1940.
And by 1944, how many were they churning out?
At peak production, the two main factories were rolling out nearly 600 Mustangs per month. Think about that. A complex machine with 15,000 parts being completed roughly every 2 hours.
What was the comparable German fighter production?
Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf combined were producing maybe 600 fighters a month in total, despite using forced labor and operating under emergency decrees.
The Americans were just outbuilding them exponentially.
And it came down to resources. In 1944, the U.S. produced about 10 times more aluminum than Germany.
Which comes back to the paper tanks. The Americans could have made them out of aluminum. They had tons to spare.
They chose paper because it was smarter, faster, and cheaper. It was a decision born from abundance and a relentless focus on efficiency, not from desperation. For the German engineers examining that tank, that was the most terrifying realization of all.
What was the psychological impact of this discovery on the Luftwaffe?
It was profound. The paper drop tank became a symbol. Captured examples were displayed at technical briefings. The message was unmistakable. American fighters could now go anywhere, escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back.
The old German tactic of waiting for the escorts to turn back due to fuel limits was now obsolete.
Completely. Top aces like Adolf Garland confirmed this in combat reports. He noted P-51s fighting aggressively over Berlin, showing no signs of fuel conservation. They had reserves.
Garland also recognized the Mustang's performance advantage at high altitude.
Yes, above 20,000 feet it outclassed both the Bf-109 and the FW-190. With unlimited range and superior high-altitude performance, the Mustang changed the entire air war.
German fighter losses must have skyrocketed.
Catastrophically. From the spring of 1944 onwards, the attrition rate became unsustainable. They were losing experienced pilots far faster than they could be replaced. By summer, they were losing over 30% of their fighter force every month. The replacements coming from training schools were hopelessly outmatched.
So the Germans knew how the Mustangs achieved their range. Could they replicate the paper tanks?
Technically, yes. They had the chemical knowledge for the resins. They could make the paper. But practically, absolutely not.
Why not?
Their chemical industry was already maxed out making synthetic fuel and explosives. Their paper mills were dedicated to essential military needs. And most importantly, what good were long-range drop tanks when the Luftwaffe was being grounded by crippling fuel shortages?
A bitter irony. The Americans solved the range problem with cheap paper tanks, just as German planes can't even get off the ground for lack of fuel.
It perfectly illustrated the core issue. Germany was fighting a war of scarcity against an enemy for whom scarcity simply wasn't a constraint. The Americans had more planes, more fuel, more pilots, more aluminium, more everything.
So the examination of that simple paper drop tank was more than just technical intelligence.
It was a confirmation of impending defeat. It showed the Germans that the Allies weren't just winning battles. They were winning the industrial war on a scale that Germany could no longer comprehend, let alone counter. The war in the air was already lost, and this disposable paper tank was the proof.